So, welcome to the first Sunday in Lent. Anyone excited? Forget it. So, today I want to discuss the great benefits in our lives of temptation. The lectionary gave us two readings about temptations today, both very classic. The classic story from Genesis of Adam and Eve being tempted in the Garden of Eden, and the story of Jesus going into the wilderness and being tempted. And I hope I'm not alone here, but I think our traditional way of understanding temptation seems a bit incomplete. I mean, we've been trained to think that temptations are bad. So why am I calling temptation a gift? We often think we're tempted to do bad things that we know we should not do. But when you think about it, that description does not feel fit either of the biblical stories we just read. I think we should get comfy because you and I need to chat. So let's start with the story in Genesis. We have been taught that this is a story about being tempted to eat an apple and disobey God. But me, the story is not about the temptation to do anything at all. The story is about something else entirely. The story is also a bit different than the one we might remember from Sunday school. So, to begin, I'd like you to bring into your mind the version of the story of Adam and Eve that we all probably carry in our heads. Here's a depiction of the scene potentially. We all know this, right? Adam and Eve were told by God not to eat apples from the tree in the middle of the garden. A snake, who is the devil, tempts Eve. Then Eve tempts Adam. Adam and Eve eat the apple, and in consequence, God ejects the pair from the garden. Simple, right? But I hope you were paying attention when Marcella just read the text, because when you read the actual biblical story, that's not really quite the same story. Many layers of cultural embellishment have been added to the story we carry in our own heads. For example, in the biblical story, Adam and Eve are not actually named, they're just the man and the woman. So that's interesting in itself. In the biblical story, the fruit is not an apple. The type of fruit is actually not specified. Early Christian art often depicts the fruit as a fig. It was when the Bible was translated by Europeans that this unspecified fruit became, in our collective minds, an apple. In the biblical story, God does not speak to the man and the woman. God speaks only to the man. In the biblical story, the snake does not speak to the woman and the man. The snake only speaks to the woman. In the biblical story, the snake is not the devil, just an animal. In the biblical story, God says humans are free to eat of every tree in the garden. So, just in passing, I'm going to remind us all the original Adam and Eve, they were vegan. Okay, just got to say that. And perhaps the most interesting point is that in the biblical story, God actually lies to the man, and the snake tells the woman the truth. So many societies have added extra cultural dimensions to this story, and some of those layers need to be discarded, perhaps. For one thing, the story of the man and the woman, I should just say Adam and Eve, so we know which one we're talking about, has been used by Christians to justify sexist behaviors for a long time. In the words of Pamela Milne, quote, the story of Eve in the book of Genesis has had a more profound negative impact on women throughout history than any other biblical story. Early Christian writers depicted Eve as subordinate and inferior to Adam because she was created after and from him, and as weak, seductive, evil, the cause of Adam's disobedience. These concepts formed the basis for later deprecatory, patriarchal Christian theologies of women. The themes of inferiority, evil, and seductiveness continue to be emphasized in the writings of Luther, Calvin, and Knox, and remain disturbingly prominent even today in fundamentalist preaching. Have to say, though, this negative image of women was also found in the early church. For example, in the epistle 1 Timothy, the author of 1 Timothy not only denigrates women, but names the Genesis story as the reason for the denigration. 1 Timothy 2, starting 11, quote, I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. That's the part we sometimes hear in church. But the very next line, Because Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided she continue with faith and love in modesty. End quote. Let's face it, the Adam and Eve story has been very detrimental to male-female relations for a very long time. The magazine Men's Health had a comment on the Genesis story that was far more succinct. This is their take. This is a male perspective, of course. It's Men's Health. Quote, while Eve receives most of the blame for getting humankind kicked out of the paradise, it should be mentioned that she was duped. God never told her about no stinking forbidden fruit. Adam, on the other hand, knew what he was doing and knew it was wrong. So on the downside, Adam was kicked out of the Garden of Eden. But on the upside, Adam finally realized Eve was naked. And that had to be worth something. It's a good point. Fortunately for us, of course, the Garden of Eden story was never meant to be taken literally anyway. The story we find in the Bible was adapted from the much older Babylonian creation story found in the Enuma Elish. It's what's called an etiology, meaning the story is designed to answer a question. And the question that the Garden of Eden story was designed to answer is, if God is the creator and God is loving, why is our world in such a mess? And of course, the question hiding behind that is, whose fault is it? You have to answer that question, right? The Genesis story has been used to justify sexism for centuries, but I think more than that, it has also shaped our society's sense of what the word temptation even means. Because we've all been taught that temptation is bad. I mean, even the Lord's Prayer, lead me not into temptation, right? For example, Chilean Catholic priest Seguno Galea describes temptation as, quote, an invitation to violate God's will or an invitation to sin. In other words, temptation is an invitation to do something bad. Even non-religious people share this view, actually. Some non-religious people define temptation as, quote, an incompatibility between a person's desired behavior and their personal goals. Everyone, except me apparently, seems to think temptation is bad. So if temptation is bad, and if we're only tempted by bad things, why am I talking about the gift of temptation? Well, here's a clue, and it was read earlier today. Our story in Matthew opens with the words, then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. The Spirit wanted Jesus to be tempted. So I'm going to say Rev Paul and the Spirit both think temptation can be a gift. I just have to convince the rest of the planet of that. But maybe there's more depth to this temptation after all. Because in many ways, temptation is not really ever about what we do. Temptation is more about who we are. Temptation is more about our identity, our sense of self. And let's consider the Adam and Eve story again. The so-called temptation was to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Ever since Sunday school, we have been taught that Adam and Eve made a mistake. Disobeying God and eating the fruit is even called the original sin. It's allegedly the reason that Adam and Eve got booted out of paradise. This action is known in traditional Christianity as the fall. But I would ask, as I asked in Chit Chat, did Adam and Eve make a mistake? The temptation in front of them was not about eating an apple. It was not even about disobeying God. It was about choosing to learn the knowledge of good and evil. In short summary, the temptation was really a decision, and the options were pretty simple. Option 1 was to remain in the garden without knowing good and evil, living your life simply obeying what you're told. Essentially living your life like a child in a daycare world where everything is taken care of for you. And option 2 was to embrace knowledge, maybe incomplete knowledge, of good and evil, and to learn to live in the real world. That includes by being surrounded by other people that are also trying to figure this all out at the same time. Living in a messy world where most people are just doing the best they can. And sadly, some people who cannot handle this freedom spend their lives creating conflict and drama. The temptation that Adam and Eve faced was not eating an apple. It was not even about disobeying God. The temptation they faced was whether or not they wanted to remain childish and live in a simplistic world, or whether they wanted to grow up and live in the real world. The temptation they faced was whether they were happy to be coddled their entire lives, or whether they wanted to live into their God given potential in the real world. The temptation was about their identity, and they chose to grow up. And I will now challenge 2,000 years of tradition and state that Adam and Eve did not make a mistake. They chose to grow up. And thanks be to God for that. We wouldn't be here. And in a way, this idea isn't really that strange. It might even match your own experience of raising children. If you had children of your own, I hope you can relate. And if you didn't, well, maybe you remember being a child yourself. But we raise young children in a world with child locks on the kitchen cabinets and simple rules like do not cross the street unless you're holding my hand. We remove many choices from children so that they grow up in a safe world. But as children grow up, we remove the child locks and we release them from the simplistic rules. And instead, we teach them how to navigate the real world themselves. We teach them about good and evil. We prepare them to live in the real world. The choosing to learn about good and evil was not about disobeying God as a child might disobey a parent. Learning about good and evil was simply the desire to grow up into adults. And again, I'm so grateful the man and the woman made the right choice. And let's also discuss the temptations of Jesus, because these temptations do not actually fit the mold either. Jesus was tempted 3 times, at least in the version we read from Matthew. And what were these 3 temptations? Well, I would reframe them a bit. That Jesus was tempted to perhaps feed the world, because if he can turn one rock into a piece of bread, he could have done it for many, many people. The temptation was jumping off the building was to perform miracles and to lead politically. But do you notice anything in common between those 3 temptations? Because there's at least one thing that all those temptations have in common, and that is that they're all really good things. I mean, if Jesus had chosen to feed the world, that'd be fantastic, right? Same thing for being a miracle worker or even a political leader. Hands up who wished that Jesus was running for one of our political parties. Anyone? The temptations offered to Jesus were all really good things. And Jesus resisted those temptations not because they were bad, but because Jesus had a different mission. Jesus had a different identity. Jesus was not a baker. Jesus was not principally a miracle worker. Jesus was not a political leader. Jesus was a teacher and a healer, and those aren't on the list. In fact, in Matthew, after Jesus returns from the wilderness, he first calls the fishers to follow him. And then almost immediately after that, his very first act is teaching and healing, living into his true identity. The temptations of Jesus were not about what Jesus might do. The temptations were about who Jesus would be. It's about identity. And so finally, why did the Spirit potentially want Jesus to be tempted by the devil? Because it's only when we actually are tempted and we see how we respond to temptation, we know who we are. And that is worth a lot. I remember one course in seminary where we discussed how ministers should behave. Yes, they really have courses like that. And we covered many topics. But in one class, we only talked about one thing, which was stealing from our own churches. And that was a discussion. And all of the students, of course, including me, said, oh, there's no way I would ever steal from my future congregation. But of course, the professor had done this a few times before, and he knew how to motivate discussion. And for one thing, he invited us to imagine more and more alluring amounts of money. He also invited us to imagine, well, maybe we felt underpaid or unappreciated or something else. And all of us, of course, were happy to say, no, of course, we won't steal from our future congregations. But we thought there might be like $100 on the plate. But the professor invited us to consider larger amounts. Would we steal if we knew we could get away with it? 50 grand? 100 grand? What about stealing from the church to give the money away to people who really need it? It's not hard to resist the temptation to steal $100, but the conversation among students got way more interesting when larger sums were on the table. And in the end, the conversation was not even about money anyway. It was about our understanding of ministry and our identity. The discussion about temptation helped us understand ourselves better. The discussion about temptation was not really about what we would do, it was about who we would be in ministry. It was about identity. And if you're curious, no, I don't steal from congregations. So we can learn about our own identities by paying attention to our own temptations. Because there are at least three things we can learn. We learn about ourselves, sadly, maybe, when we give in to temptation. We learn about ourselves when we resist temptation. And perhaps more importantly, we learn about ourselves by simply paying attention to what is it that tempts us the most anyway? Whether we resist or give in, what are we actually attracted to? We can learn a lot about ourselves by that. One temptation I see in many congregations, maybe including ours, is to believe that our past defines our future. That's a very attractive temptation for many people. And to me, this is like the temptation to remain in the Garden of Eden, safe and secure, rather than to engage in the real world that's right around us. Or, as we discussed last week, the temptation to believe we cannot really make a difference to anyone else anyway, or the temptation to believe that we cannot find our own healing and hope right here. But I think that's a different sermon. So, just to prime the pump a bit, because I'm saying that this conversation is the basis for a Lenten discussion on Wednesday, questions I have in mind for Wednesday you can think about, but there may be other questions. And I won't say this every week, but just to be clear, when we have discussion groups, I never want people to share stories they don't actually want to share. So this isn't pulling teeth. And you'll know that once you hear the first question. What have you learned about yourself from temptations? There may be stories you're willing to share around that. Likely the stories we won't share. What do you think of the idea that temptation can be a gift? And I'd love to hear some feedback on whether or not Adam and Eve made a mistake. We can do that one too. So there may be other questions, but I'm hoping we can just have a good discussion about the gifts of temptation and other aspects of temptation on Wednesday. As Lent begins, I trust this will be a period of reflection for all of us, as individuals and as a congregation. And I invite us to deeply consider our own temptations and to learn from them, to learn more about who we really are. Enjoy the journey of Lent. We're all in this together. Enjoy the gift of temptation. Amen.